logic, you need to be able to read this. It is read as the following. It is read as, if A is provable and it is consistent, and it's consistent to assume B, then conclude C. So, when you see this structure, the way that you read this structure is if A is provable, so we're making an assumption, right? If A is provable and it is consistent, all of this is represented by the colon. So, if A is provable, A, and it is consistent to, and it is consistent, all of that is the colon, right? To assume B, then conclude C, right? So, if A is provable and it is consistent to assume B, then you need to conclude C. That's basically how it's read. It's extremely important that you get the hang of this. So, you know, what you might want to do is, just on your own, right, put in different letters, right? Put in W, put in P, put in F, doesn't matter. And, you know, if it is provable, right, if A is provable, then it is consistent to assume B, then conclude C. And once you do it enough times and you get the sort of linguistic structure correct, you'll memorize it. It'll be simple. We're obviously going to complicate this, right? We always start, my teaching style, which I think hopefully is effective in communicating, you know, rather esoteric aspects of whatever it is that I'm discussing. It's always best to make sure that we start on a duh level, right? You can get it. We're going to take this template like we've always done, like I've always done in all of my lecture series, and we'll complicate it. And we're really going to complicate it in this lecture. I'm going to go slow because it's going to end up getting extremely technical. But hopefully I can, and not even hopefully, you will be able to understand all the way throughout until we get to the end of section 4.1. So it's read last time, if A is provable and it is consistent to assume B, then conclude C. So that's that. So, returning to the ABC murder story, which now you have read, let's go and talk a bit, and don't read, you know, I probably should have said this before I told you to go read it, but, you know, don't try and, like, memorize the details, just have an understanding, right? There's a murder, people have alibis, you know, who's the suspect, right? This is like typical CSI stuff, right? This is why it's so useful, right? This is why critical thinking skills are so important, because forensics require you to link pieces of data that aren't necessarily connected, and your system has to be flexible enough to discard the assumptions that you thought were true but were proven false, and add assumptions that you think will demonstrate you know, the guilt of some party, right? As you know, the legal system is built on the concept that you are innocent until proven guilty. You need a system that is flexible, and the system won't collapse when old information is replaced by new information, right? And this is the system, right? Specifically, this truth maintenance system. Okay, so, reading from page 15 now. If we assume that Abbott is the primary suspect, so let's just assume that Abbott is the primary murder suspect because he is the primary beneficiary of the deceased and he has no alibi, there are three assertions that can be made. So, for the sake of argument, assume that Abbott is our primary murder suspect in the ABC. So you have Abbott, Babbitt, Cabot, and there's a murder. You're the investigator. You're the detective. You have to figure out who did the murder. You think that Abbott is the primary murder suspect. Why? He's a primary murder suspect because he is the beneficiary of the inheritance, right? So, you know, I stand to gain by the death of someone else because I'm going to benefit from their death. And also, I don't have a good alibi. I mean, this is basic. That's like duh. And if it's duh, then we're on the same level, right? So, let's just say Abbott is the primary murder suspect. The question is why? Because he's the beneficiary of the victim and he doesn't have a good alibi. So if we assume that Abbott is the primary murder suspect because he's the primary beneficiary of the deceased and he has no alibi, there are three assertions that can be made. So the assertions are the following. The first assertion is what we'll call suspect Abbott. Right? Suspect Abbott is defined, this concept, suspect Abbott, is defined in terms of Abbott as the primary murder suspect, right? So he's a suspect. Him being a primary murder suspect, we'll just sort of phrase as suspect Abbott. Number two, beneficiary Abbott is the second one. Right? Beneficiary Abbott is number two. And this is Abbott is the beneficiary of the victim, obviously, right? He benefits financially from the death of the victim. And then finally, number three, alibi Abbott. A-L-I-B-I. Alibi Abbott, and this is Abbott as alibi was in the Albany hotel at the time. And in the when you read it, they say it's like a distinguished hotel. They keep records, proper records on file, and it's a what's the word? It's like a renowned hotel. So it's legitimate to have your name in the record books that you were there is a legitimate sort of alibi. Okay, so believing that Abbott, right? You as a detective now, you have to think about yourself as sort of a detective, a forensic person. You as a detective, you have to try and make sense of the evidence that you've been given. This is why it's imperative to see that this is critical thinking. And I specifically like the Quine example, because the ABC murder example, because it's obviously applicable. This is people do this. Thousands of people throughout, probably hundreds of thousands of people throughout the world do this, daily. Believing that Abbott is the killer, is justified by non-monotonic default logic. In the last section I talked about default logic. This is the format for default logic, and here's how your default and I probably should put that there. So this is our format for default logic, and trying to make sense of the ABC murder story is done so by the application of default logic, and we need a system of uncertainty and flexibility, right? A system where we can discard old assumptions with new assumptions, and non-monotonic logic is a system that allows us to do that. So we express this belief, right? We express the belief that Abbott is the murderer, right? Why do we think he's a murderer? We think he's the murderer because he is the beneficiary and he doesn't have a good enough alibi. How do we represent that in default logic notation? As the following, right? So it's beneficiary So that's how it's represented, right? We represent our belief that Abbott is the killer like this. And what we're going to do now is apply this template to this assumption, right? We're making an assumption. Remember, this is important. When we're talking about non-monotonic logic, we're not saying that this is true or false. We're saying that we need to represent our belief, right? The assumption. We believe that he is the murder suspect. That belief can be demonstrated to be true or false, but we might think it's true at one point, get new information, and we'll have to recalibrate our system, right? So it's not a matter of truth or falsity, it's a matter of strengthening our belief. And later, I'll talk about a very complex idea of weighting beliefs, how weight emphasis is applied to beliefs, but we're not there yet, right? How is this read? So what I've done is I've sort of broken down the structure so that you can see how this is read, right? So if it is provable, just like before, right? If it is provable that X is the beneficiary, right? If it is provable that X is the beneficiary, and we know that X refers to Abbott, right? So if it is provable that X is the beneficiary, and it is consistent